Vaccines. Governments are lining up to vaccinate their people. They are reaching out to India, US, China, and Russia to acquire vaccines so that they can quickly save lives, race ahead of other nations, and open up their economies. But what happens when, in the middle of such high stakes, the vaccines that your nation trusted and spent billions on don't work, and the epidemic continues to rage on? What happens when your trusted vaccine vendor tells you that you'll have to buy more shots and revaccinate your people? What happens when you realize that your nation is being conned? And what do you do when your country is trapped in a cycle of heavy payments for vaccines that end up ineffective every time? Well, then, there is a fallout, a big one. And that is where the Arab countries in the Middle East are headed. Hi, and welcome to TFI Global, the foreign affairs and geopolitical analysis arm of the TFI Media Group. I am your host Shubhangi, and in this video, I will tell you how the Arab nation's patience with China is fast running out. Let's begin. Chinese vaccines against COVID-19 are highly ineffective. Countries in the Middle East, particularly the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, have learnt this the hard way. UAE has a population of 10 million and has administered over 11.5 million vaccine doses so far. However, cases are rising in the Arab country once again, sending Emirati authorities into a tizzy. Since Chinese vaccines have failed to produce COVID-19 antibodies in the people of the UAE, the Arab country has now opted for citizens to be inoculated with a third booster dose of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. It was over a month ago that both the UAE and Bahrain had decided to provide a third booster shot to all people, since 2 shots of the Chinese vaccine was simply ineffective. Realization now seems to have dawned upon them that a third dose will be just as ineffective if it is the Chinese vaccine, which is why they are now offering the Pfizer vaccine to already fully inoculated citizens. Needless to say, both the UAE and Bahrain are annoyed with China, which announced a third booster shot only after selling its vaccines to all of these countries. The UAE had completely opened its economy, but due to a rise in infections, it might have to rethink on that count. China, on the other hand, has been testing the patience of these rich Arab nations. Ineffective Chinese vaccines do not come cheap. Arab countries are anything but poor. However, they too seem irritated for having paid China exorbitant rates for vaccines which do not work. In Sri Lanka, the Chinese Sinopharm vaccine is costing the government $15 per dose. That gives us an idea regarding the amount of cash which the UAE and Bahrain might have doled out to China, only to end up getting their citizens vaccinated with a third booster shot of the Pfizer vaccine. China has been targeting developing nations with its vaccines and extorting them. However, by playing its dirty games in the Arab world, China has really shot itself in the foot. The Arab countries have no qualms against paying a high price for the vaccines as long as they work. Yet by selling vaccines which are ineffective against COVID-19, China has brought its push towards the Middle East to a screeching halt. Already, China's near-romantic involvement with Iran has been a headache for countries like the UAE and Bahrain, which are signatories to the Abraham Accords with Israel. Now, these countries will be forced to rethink their ties with the paper dragon and recalibrate their foreign policy into one which is more pro-America. China was being entertained for so long by such countries since the paper dragon is a major importer of Arab oil. The betrayal by China with its ineffective vaccines has been just too big for these countries to ignore. Already, the Arab world, led by Saudi Arabia, was skeptical about China due to its unholy ties with Iran. Now, they have been given reason enough to ensure that the paper dragon makes no headway in the Middle East. The Arab world is expected to turn to the United States while also stepping up its ties with Russia. This directly affects China's ambitions in the region, as both the US and Russia seek to arrest China's somewhat growing influence in the Middle East. With its failed vaccine diplomacy, China has emerged as a net loser in almost all parts of the world, most recently in the Middle East. Earlier in Seychelles, a strategically located island of fewer than 100,000 people in East Africa, it was found that Chinese vaccines in no manner helped the country develop herd immunity. Seychelles is the most vaccinated nation against COVID-19 in the world. The island nation made a big mistake, however. It relied heavily on Sinopharm to vaccine most of its citizens. The island country is now grappling with a fresh surge of infections, and restrictions have been reimposed. There are others as well. Peru, Chile, and most recently Bahrain and the UAE all have made one common mistake. They relied heavily on the Chinese vaccines. All these countries soon realized their folly and are now trying to address the blunder made by them in the form of trusting China. China has been carefully trying to build its image in the Middle East, but what it's left with is the image of an extortionist or a con artist. And that is exactly why there could be a fallout between Arab nations and China. China touted its vaccines as the world's cure to COVID-19. The UAE and Bahrain saw China's vaccines could help them get over the pandemic. However, these ambitions ended in ruin, and both the Arab countries are now turning to an American vaccine to alleviate their woes. It goes without saying that the two countries have realized the risk of relying on China, and will hereon continue with the traditional approach of looking towards the US.